Even if you've never heard of John Kluge, you're definitely living in the world he created. For a few years, he was the wealthiest man in America. When he died, his net worth was a staggering $6.5 billion. That's enough to buy New York Knicks tickets and still have enough pocket change for a private island. But the reason his legacy as a pioneering media mogul has flown under the radar for so long is because he hated the showboating that's so common in modern billionaires. He hated that behavior as much as cookie-cutter executive thinking, risk-averse business decisions, and following the crowd. These might be the typical lessons from an Ivy League business school. But John Kluge's rags to riches life story contains more sagely wisdom than an economics book authored by the Dalai Lama. In fact, his strategy for utilizing emerging technologies and seeking out sectors where he had little competition has become the playbook for every Silicon Valley CEO. So, how did this German immigrant philanthropist achieve the American dream? How did he flip floundering businesses into $1 billion empire? And how did schoolyard games teach him the basics of business when he was just a kid? Chapter 1. Natural-born businessmen. John Werner Kluge was born in 1914 in Chemnitz, a manufacturing city in Germany. A backdrop of business naturally fed into his upbringing, but it was his father's tragic death in World War I that helped spark his entrepreneurial spirit. That's because his mother had to work 6 days a week as a typist to provide for John and his grandmother. The fact they lived in a cramped, run-down tenement house while the rest of the country's economy was booming must have given him an early, bitter taste of financial hardship. Yet, John was able to test his money-making muscles before he'd even earn his first dollar, or Deutschmark. He did this by playing marbles. Those small glass orbs were the Pokemon cards of yesteryear, and just like any playground trend, John wanted to get involved. But what made him different was he played for keeps. That might not sound like a big deal to you, but if you're a broke child, then you know the value of fashionable toys are priceless. So, if you're going to play for keeps, you have to be good. You have to take risks. Young Kluge became so formidable at calculating chances that he claimed to have won more than 2,000 marbles. No wonder neighboring kids stopped playing with him. He found new friends though, because his family moved to the other side of the city. Here, his mother met a German-born widower visiting from America, which is how John Kluge immigrated to the US at just 8 years old. It was 1922. Lines of immigrants aboard the USS George Washington waved at the Statue of Liberty. Kluge was so taken in by the city that he vowed to return one day. In the meantime, the family settled just outside of Detroit, Michigan. Kluge's stepfather wanted him to follow in his contracting and painting footsteps. No doubt he was motivated by providing stability. But it was too late. Kluge was hooked on being an entrepreneur. He sold apples from his family's fruit trees. He delivered newspapers. He washed windows. He even set up a lawn cutting and snow shoveling business where he trained local boys to work for him. Kluge had employees, franchises, and an empire before he was even fluent in English. That's pretty impressive for a 10-year-old kid. Yet, despite this early start, Kluge said he was yet to take the biggest risk of his life. Shortly after graduating 8th grade, his stepfather doubled his efforts to make Kluge leave school to work for him full-time. The lure of stability must have been tempting for a poor boy who grew up in poverty. But Kluge knew education was going to be his key to success. He reasoned that if he had gotten this far from what he could teach himself, then utilizing a real education would take him to great heights. So, he persuaded his stepfather to let him attend high school for a single year. Seriously, how many kids begged their parents to let them go to school? Once that year was up, his stepdad forbade Kluge from attending school again. So John did the riskiest thing of his life. He ran away from home to make a name for himself. So how did he do it? Well, it's time to learn how history works as we unearth the business wisdom of John Kluge, the richest man that history forgot. This week's video is sponsored by Trade Coffee. As fans of history, you should be getting your coffee from all around the world. Trade Coffee makes coffee exciting, connecting you with over 450 coffees from over 55 local roasters, including dark roasts, espressos, blends, and rare roasts. Their matching algorithm curates the perfect coffee match for you based on your taste preferences and surprises you with a new variety every time. For example, it knows what I like, and it matched me with Feast's Milk and Honey. It's a medium dark full-bodied roast that delivers a taste like s'mores, creamy milk, and a lingering taste of cocoa nibs. I used to drink coffee just as a way to get me going, but when I started tasting good coffee with trade, I realized that you really shouldn't sacrifice taste for energy, and I'm never going back to that disgusting old coffee. Fresh coffee is better coffee, and the coffee will always be shipped within 48 hours of being roasted. Visit drinktrade.com/howhistoryworks to sign up and save $15 on select plans and get your first bag of coffee free. With free shipping, customizable plans, and anytime cancellation, Trade is making it easier to discover better coffee. Chapter 2. The difference between learning and getting an education. Kluge was now a homeless high schooler. Then one day, he was washing the car of a teacher who had changed his life, Garcia Gray DeRitt. As soon as she heard that the student moonlighting as a car washer had nowhere to live, she brought him into her home. Here, he got his real education. Kluge was so dedicated to learn to speak English without his German accent that he always carried a German to English dictionary with him. Kids teased him, but that only strengthened his determination. But it was his teacher's guests that gave him a valuable insight into the way people conduct themselves. Garcia Gray DeRitt was so respected in their town that the likes of judges and high-profile businessmen would visit her to drink tea and chat about world affairs. Over time, young Kluge gleaned worldly knowledge from their interactions. He claimed these so-called signposts into American culture became a valuable foundation to his business philosophy. Given how secretive Kluge had been, we can't know for sure what those are, but we can imagine it's something to do with the details of business deals. Later in life, close friends and biographers praised Kluge's love for hammering out a good business deal. He loved the personal interaction that comes with a joint venture, they said. This knack for working with people, coupled with his thirst for taking risk. By the time he was in college, his reputation for studiousness was eclipsed by his infamy at the card table. First, he spent a year at the then-named Detroit City College before transferring to Columbia on a scholarship. He studied economics, no surprise there. No doubt, his formal education in number crunching helped him make a formidable poker player during dormitory card games. In fact, his gambling was so well known amongst the students that even the dean caught wind of his antics. Upon being summoned to the dean's office, the angry head threatened to revoke Kluge's scholarship should he ever catch him playing cards again. The witty Kluge promised the dean that he'd never be caught again. True to his word, he made sure that the school never figured out he was still gambling on campus. Perhaps the thing that kept him in the teacher's good books were his high grades and business acumen. He ran a shoe business, a garment side hustle, and even sold school supplies to fellow students. He was the dining hall's meal pricer, and at one point was the private secretary for the son of the president of China. This inspired him to journey to China upon graduation to set up his own company to rival the East India Trading Company. Unfortunately for him, the ensuing war between China and Japan ruined everything. So, upon graduation, he took a job at a paper company on one strange condition. He'd work without salary, but with expenses covered, and 1/3 interest in the business if he doubled sales. The owner's jaw must have hit the floor when they heard this proposal from some fresh college grad. And their jaws must have fallen through the floorboards when they saw how John Kluge, true to his word, hit his sales targets with ease. Kluge now had an education, capital, and clout to officially start his company. But before he could cut his own path, his prospects would be affected by a little thing called World War II. Chapter 3. Building an Empire from Ash. Maybe it was his German heritage and American patriotism. Or maybe it was his gambling skills and uncanny ability to read an opponent. Whichever caught the attention of the US government first, the young college graduate served his adopted country by becoming an intelligence agent. That's right, Kluge was trained to think like a spy. Kluge worked at the legendary P.O. Box 1142, the codename for a super secretive interrogation facility which employed unconventional methods. Methods such as swimming pools, leisurely activities, and using fake Russian officers to make the POWs fearful of being shipped to Siberia if they failed to comply. Notable residents included German rocket scientist Werner von Braun, inventor of infrared decoding Heinz Schilk, and even the infamous spy master Reinhard Gehlen. It's fair to say that if your 9-to-5 is playing 4D chess with the sharpest minds Nazi Germany has to offer, then by the time the war is over, you'll be smarter than Einstein with a Neuralink. Assuming Musk delivers on a promise for once. Once Kluge was relieved of war duties, he saw how the America he immigrated to was different. The war had changed the dynamics of business, manufacturing, and economics. He must have wondered whether the wisdom he'd been building would apply in a post-war world. For example, people weren't sure if radio was going to stick around. On the one hand, he'd see a boom in the lead-up to the global conflict. Yet the emergence of television and cinema proved images were really worth 1,000 words. But Kluge wasn't fazed. He was never one to follow the herd. In fact, he recognized that the radio was about to get a second wind. Admittedly, he understood this from an article in the Wall Street Journal. It detailed how raw materials for television were costly given how wartime efforts had diverted resources so drastically. Kluge reasoned, correctly, that as much as radio was on the ropes, it wasn't over until the fat lady sings. Or at least, until the fat lady sings on TV. And if there was still a user base for radio, what was the rush to give up on the medium? Plus, from there, a viable radio station could leapfrog into other ventures. He figured out that he could turn the $15,000 startup cost for a radio station into $340,000 within a year. And that's in 1946. By 2024 calculations, he was looking at raking in $5.75 million. This dovetailed beautifully into his lifelong business mantra: make money and minimize taxes. There's no point of having huge turnover if your overhead is crazy. Kluge understood the potential in connecting directly with consumers, especially for advertisers. So he snapped up an independent station called WGAY. In a few years, with more capital behind him and changes in the television landscape, he was able to snap up a few small TV stations and a couple more radio stations. Slowly but surely, he was building his own network, demonstrating his knack for utilizing tech and watching the bottom line. This same approach helped run a food brokerage. His ventures into food distribution introduced Americans to Fritos and Cheetos. But it was his pivot away from mom-and-pop stores and two chains with potential for longevity that helped redefine the food industry's product pipeline. So, if you've ever wondered who introduced Cheeto dust to the nation, you can thank Kluge. Soon, his experience and insight even made him a go-to consultant for advertising and distribution. However, despite these successes, there was a lack of focus. Kluge still needed to figure out how to leverage his growing media empire with his ventures in advertising and distribution. To us modern-day viewers, it might seem obvious how he transformed his business dream into a multimedia reality. For Kluge, he had to wait for another business to go under before he could swoop in to save the day. Chapter 4. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Okay, here's the quick backstory of Dumont Television. Near the start of the 20th century, it was the pioneer of American commercialized television. Its rivals were NBC and CBS, but at its height, Dumont was the biggest player in town. It was so big that the Federal Trade Commission had to step in to stop it from monopolizing the industry. To some, that's a good problem to have. Unfortunately, Dumont had always been in a precarious financial situation, despite its industry dominance, and things got worse because of technological changes. Imagine you're a software engineer with an app or video game to sell, but you can only ship on one distribution platform. Do you stick it on Steam or on the Apple App Store? What about Epic Games or Google's Play Store? Back in the days of airwaves, the equivalents were the frequencies of radio waves. The FCC verdict forced Dumont to focus on UHF, ultra high frequency, which had not yet become the standard. The direct line of sight needed by the tech meant mountains and forests blocked the signals. In effect, Dumont had lost its rural audience with the flip of a switch. It was like being forced to only make HD products in a world of standard definition. Dumont's vast empire was turning hollow. Even their partnership deal with Paramount did little to clot their hemorrhaging business. Who in their right mind would buy it? John Kluge. That's who. Where others saw risk, he saw potential. Competitors may have been prepared to pay an arm and a leg for a profitable company, but Kluge saw the value in growing an independent, especially if you can make a beachhead before rivals showed up. After purchasing a controlling interest in Paramount, Kluge scooped the remnants of the Dumont network. In 1958, he had become its board chairman and largest shareholder. He even got the bulk of the shares directly from the founder, Alan B. Dumont, for around $6 million. Kluge reasoned, correctly once again, that Alan Dumont's problem was that he was good at building television studios, but terrible at marketing. Thankfully, Kluge had vast experience running a consumer-focused company. Plus, Kluge had acquired an outdoor advertising firm and direct mailing enterprise. Now, with his radio stations and nationwide television circuit, he had a way for advertisers to reach any audience in any state on any medium. Heck, one of his stations ran an advertising campaign that was so in your face that it promised one lucky winner a one-way ticket to Australia for their mother-in-law. Nowadays, an in-house multimedia advertising campaign is a common tactic for any big company. But back then, this was radical. In one bold move, Kluge had laid the groundwork for a revolution in media. The printing press may have spread mass communications, but Kluge was the guy who stuck it on buses, billboards, and before soap operas. Now was the era of Multimedia. But what's a revolution without its doctrine? Chapter 5: The Big Payday. With Kluge manning the helm in 1959, their first year saw a $5.6 million gross. The year after, they expanded into more profitable properties. But that wouldn't have happened if Kluge hadn't been a diligent leader. He was quoted as saying, "Growth is an enabling factor in attracting the best people, and the best people are essential to the organization. There's nothing worse than having a ceiling on top of young, creative people. Other executives might be trained to keep employees in their place, but Kluge recognized the benefits and risks of having his employees work with him instead of for him. He knew that once he had cultivated a high-grade management team, he just needed to trust them to do their job. Why would he micromanage people now if he didn't micromanage them when he was cutting lawns in Detroit all those years ago? But Kluge didn't kick back doing nothing. He policed the expenses like the IRS hunting Al Capone. Once, he called up an executive to congratulate him on having the highest phone bill that month. From then on, his company's phone bills were low. He was such a stickler for keeping costs down that Forbes eventually named him the cheapskate billionaire. But Kluge said he wasn't being frugal out of greediness. He knew that the television business was so fragile that it could collapse if their cash flow wasn't in check. For example, the HQ was in New Jersey, not New York, because the rent was cheaper. He needed a robust budget to weather the lows, and there were lows. A venture into Laserdisc proved Kluge didn't always get it right with emerging tech. Not to mention the lawsuits. One was from a former television producer trying to secure rights to their kids' show. In response, Kluge ordered the destruction of the original tapes. The result? An $18 million payday for the ex-employee. Oops. But there were highs too. Shows like MASH and All in the Family were big money spinners for Multimedia. But Kluge was tired of making business decisions on stock value. He pined for the days when he didn't have to listen to risk-averse shareholders. So, he took out a personal loan of $1.3 billion so that he could pay out Multimedia. Next to the decision to run away from home, this was the biggest risk of his entire life. But this gamble paid off. Big time. One day, Rupert Murdoch came knocking. He was interested in the network of local stations Multimedia had cultivated, plus its inroads into the emerging technology of cellular. He offered Kluge upwards of $4 billion for the ecosystem, which Kluge gracefully accepted. Multimedia's network of radio and television stations became the core of Fox News Media, and Kluge became the wealthiest man in America. Yet despite such media attention, the media pioneer kept a low profile through his life, business deals, and ex-wives. He seldom gave interviews, ducked out of high society, and never put his name on a building. Even when he donated $60 million to his former university before updating that donation as time went on, he remarked that he'd rather change minds than have his name on a monument. In fact, he stipulated that his donation go towards scholarships for minorities. He didn't want the hardships he faced as an immigrant to impede anyone else. To date, 200 students are benefiting from his scholarship at any one time. In his golden years, he focused on philanthropy. He gave huge donations to AIDS research and even collected Australian Aboriginal art as part of his relationship with museums. The remaining smaller business ventures of Multimedia fizzled out until the name was seldomly recognized by anyone outside of economic history. Thankfully, for a man who is all about building businesses on relationships, risk, and innovation, it makes sense that his headstone offers us one last playful piece of insight for the entrepreneurs of the future. I'm wiser. I sold my body for fertilizer. So what do you think? Was Kluge a risk taker, or was he the case of the man in the right place at the right time? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see part 2 of this story, make sure to check out our video on Rupert Murdoch. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.